The throne room went silent the moment the queen pointed at me. Every eye in that vast hall of glass and gold turned in my direction, and I felt the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down on my shoulders. I was the only human standing among nobles who had ruled star systems before my ancestors had learned to write. My name is Elias Marsh, and I was sent here as a simple envoy, nothing more. I did not come to make history. I came to sign papers, shake hands, and go home. But sometimes history finds you whether you are looking for it or not. The queen's name was Ythera Velsarn, and she had been crowned only 3 days earlier. She was 26 years old, though among her people that was still considered young enough to be called a girl by the older lords who whispered behind painted fans. Her mother had died suddenly, some said from a sickness, others said from something far darker, and Ythera had been pushed onto the throne before she was ready. I could see it in her eyes, fear dressed up as pride. I had been invited to her coronation court as a courtesy, a token gesture to show the galaxy that the Veiled Dominion welcomed all species, even the newest one. Humanity had only joined the wider community of stars a few years earlier. We were the babies of the galaxy, the ones who still had training wheels on our starships as far as some of these ancient houses were concerned. I stood near the back of the hall in my plain gray diplomatic uniform, no medals, no decorations, nothing to draw attention. I was there to observe, to nod politely, and to report back to Earth that the ceremony had gone well. That was the entire plan. Then one of her advisors, a thin man with silver skin named Doran Kesh, leaned toward the queen's ear and whispered something. I did not hear the words, but I saw her lips curl into a small, cold smile. "Bring the human forward," she said. The words echoed through the hall louder than they should have. I felt every gaze shift toward me like a wave pulling back before it crashes. I stepped forward because refusing an order from a queen in front of her entire court was not something a diplomat could do, no matter how uneasy it made me feel. I walked down the long aisle between rows of nobles in robes made from fabrics I could not name, past guards holding weapons taller than myself, until I stood at the base of her throne. Up close, she looked even younger than I expected. Her crown seemed too heavy for her, as if it might slip if she moved too quickly, but her eyes were sharp, and there was something desperate in them, something that needed to prove itself in front of a room full of people who did not believe she deserved to be there. "You are the human they sent," she said, not as a question. "Yes, Your Majesty, Elias Marsh, representing Earth." She looked me over slowly, the way someone examines an animal at a market rather than a person standing in front of them. "Tell me, human, how old is your species again? I am told you have only just learned to leave your own little world." Laughter rippled through the court, soft at first, then louder as more nobles joined in. I kept my face still. I had been trained for exactly this kind of moment, though I never imagined it would come from someone so young, trying so hard to look powerful. "We are young by your standards, Your Majesty," I said calmly, "but we have learned quickly." I meant it as a simple statement, not a challenge. But something in my tone must have struck her wrong, or perhaps she was looking for any excuse to prove herself in front of her court, because her expression hardened. "Quickly," she repeated, testing the word like it tasted strange in her mouth. "Yes, I have heard this about your kind. Quick to arrive, quick to ask for a seat at tables you have not earned. Tell me, Elias Marsh, what has your barely grown species actually given to this galaxy, besides noise and a hunger for attention?" The hall grew quieter, waiting to see how I would react. I said nothing yet, I simply listened. She continued, warming to her own words now, feeding off the attention of her court, like a fire fed by fresh wood. "My family has ruled for 10,000 years. 10,000 years of order, of art, of conquest and peace, built with patience your species cannot even imagine. And you stand there in your plain little uniform, as if you belong in a room built by people whose ancestors were already old when your kind still lived in caves and threw stones at each other." More laughter now, louder, crueler. Doran Kesh smiled beside her like a man watching his favorite performance. "Your species should be grateful," Ythera said, her voice rising. "Grateful that we allow you to stand here at all. You are nothing but a barely evolved nuisance, dressed up in a uniform pretending to be important. Perhaps one day, in a few more thousand years, you might actually deserve a seat in a room like this." The hall erupted into laughter. Real laughter now, the kind that echoes off marble and glass and fills every corner of a room. I stood there and let it wash over me. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I did not argue or defend or explain. I felt something inside me go very calm, very quiet, the way the ocean goes still, right before a storm arrives. I looked at her for a long moment, long enough that some of the laughter began to fade into an uncertain silence, as if the court sensed something was happening that they did not fully understand. Then I bowed, a perfect, correct bow, exactly the kind protocol required, no more and no less. I did not smile, I did not frown, my face showed nothing at all. And then I turned around and walked out of the throne room without saying a single word. I heard my own footsteps echo through the silence behind me, steady and unhurried, each step landing with the same calm rhythm as the last. Nobody stopped me, nobody called after me. For a moment, the entire hall seemed frozen, unsure of what had just happened, unsure of what silence like that actually meant. I did not look back. Outside the palace, the twin suns of that world were setting, painting the sky in colors of orange and violet I still was not used to seeing. My transport waited at the edge of the courtyard, and my aide, a young woman named Grace Whitfield, stood beside it with a worried expression on her face. "Elias, what happened in there? Everyone is talking. They say the Queen insulted you in front of the whole court." "She did," I said simply. "And what did you say back?" "Nothing." Grace blinked at me, clearly expecting more. "Nothing at all." "Nothing at all," I confirmed, climbing into the transport. There was nothing worth saying to a room like that. She followed me inside, still looking confused, still waiting for an explanation that would make sense of what she had just witnessed. I did not give her one, not yet. I simply stared out the window as the palace shrank behind us, its golden towers catching the last light of the twin suns. I was not angry. That surprised me more than anything else. I searched myself for anger and found only a strange, cold clarity, like a lens coming into focus after years of blur. I thought about my grandfather, a quiet man who rarely raised his voice, who used to tell me that the loudest people in any room were often the most afraid, and that real strength did not need an audience to prove itself. I thought about every lesson I had been taught before coming out here among the stars. Lessons about patience, about choosing battles, about knowing exactly when silence said more than any argument ever could. Ysthera Velsarn was 26 years old and terrified of losing a throne she had barely sat upon. She needed someone to laugh at, someone smaller than herself, to make her feel larger in front of a court that doubted her. I understood that. I even, in some strange way, felt sorry for her. But understanding someone's fear does not mean you owe them your patience forever. Back at the Human Embassy that evening, I sat alone in my office for a long while, staring at a blank screen, thinking about what needed to happen next. Word of the insult would spread through the Dominion by morning. I was certain of that. Nobles loved gossip more than they loved their own titles, and a story about a human being humiliated in open court was exactly the kind of thing that traveled fast. I did not plan to file a complaint. I did not plan to demand an apology. Diplomats who ask for apologies from proud young rulers rarely receive anything but more insults, dressed up in polite language, designed to look like regret, while meaning nothing at all. Instead, I opened a different file, a quiet one, a list of every joint project between Earth and the Veiled Dominion currently running through my desk, every shared research program, every human engineer stationed in their shipyards, every supply line quietly keeping their systems running smoother than anyone in that golden palace probably realized. I began writing a report, calm and professional, with no anger in a single sentence, no accusation, no demand, just facts, Just a simple recommendation that human cooperation with the Veiled Dominion be reviewed, effective immediately. Grace knocked on my door sometime later, holding 2 cups of something warm. "You're still awake," she said, setting 1 cup down in front of me. "Thinking," I replied. "About the Queen, about what happens next." She sat across from me, studying my face carefully, the way people do when they are trying to read something that refuses to be read. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she said quietly. It was not really a question. I looked up at her, and for the first time since walking out of that golden hall, I allowed myself the smallest, faintest smile. "I already let it go," I said. "That's exactly the problem for her." Grace frowned, not understanding yet what I meant. She would understand soon enough. So would the Queen. So would the entire Dominion, sooner than any of them expected, and in a way none of them could have imagined while they were still laughing in that throne room, still certain that a quiet human walking away meant nothing at all. They were about to learn otherwise. The report I sent that night did not travel quietly for long. Within 2 days, every embassy across the Veiled Dominion capital was buzzing with the same story, though each version grew a little stranger with every retelling. Some said the human envoy had cursed the Queen under his breath. Some said he had threatened her guards. Others said he had simply smiled and walked away as if nothing in the world could touch him. Only the last version was close to true, and it was the version that made the older diplomats the most nervous. I did not attend any of the gossip circles that formed in the embassy halls that week. I stayed in my office, working through the list I had started the night of the coronation, quietly closing one project after another, sending polite, professional messages that gave no explanation beyond a simple line about reviewing current commitments. The first message went to a shipyard on the outer ring of the capital system, where a team of human engineers had been helping design a new class of cargo vessel for the Dominion's growing merchant fleet. I informed the project director, a stern old alien named Cade Farrow, that our engineers would be recalled within the week for reassignment. He replied within an hour, clearly confused. The project was nearly finished. Why would Earth pull its people now, so close to completion? I did not answer his question directly. I simply confirmed the recall date and wished him well. The second message went to a research station studying long-range communication arrays, a joint effort that had been running smoothly for almost 2 years. I informed the lead scientist there, a patient woman named Celine Vask, that our data sharing agreement would be paused pending review. She wrote back almost immediately, worried and confused, asking if something had gone wrong on our end, if there had been some kind of mistake in the paperwork. I told her there was no mistake. There was simply a decision being made, and it had already been made. One by one, I sent these same quiet messages to every human presence woven into the Dominion systems. No anger in the words, no mention of the Queen, no mention of the throne room at all. Just calm, professional notices that arrived like small stones dropped into a still pond, each one sending ripples outward that grew larger the further they traveled. Grace watched all of this happen from the doorway of my office more than once that week, arms crossed, clearly torn between admiration and worry. "You know they're going to notice," she said one afternoon, standing over my desk while I typed another quiet withdrawal notice. "You can't just pull every human worker out of a dozen projects and expect nobody to ask why." "They can ask," I said, not looking up from my screen. "I am not required to answer. Elias, this is going to look like retaliation. It is going to make us look petty." I stopped typing for a moment and looked at her directly. "Grace, I have not sent one angry word. I have made no demands. I have not mentioned the Queen once in any of these messages. All I have done is decide that Earth's people deserve to spend their skill and their time somewhere they are actually wanted. That is not retaliation. That is simply a choice." She did not have an answer for that, not right away. She left my office a few minutes later, but I could tell the thought stayed with her. Meanwhile, inside the Golden Palace, a very different conversation was happening, one I only learned about much later from contacts within the Dominion's own diplomatic corps. Queen Euthera had woken the morning after her coronation feast expecting praise. She had, in her own mind, delivered a clever performance, one that reminded her court she was not a soft young girl to be pushed around, but a queen capable of putting even a representative of another species in his place. She expected Doran Kesh to compliment her cleverness. She expected the older lords to finally begin showing her the respect they had withheld since her mother's death. Instead, she found her advisors distracted, murmuring among themselves in corners, receiving reports that made their faces grow pale. "What is happening?" she demanded of Doran Kesh during a private meeting 3 days after the coronation, her voice sharp with impatience. "Why does everyone look as though the sky is falling?" Doran hesitated before answering, something he rarely did. "Your Majesty, the humans are withdrawing, quietly, from several projects at once." Euthera frowned, not yet understanding the scale of what was happening. So the little human ran home and complained to his superiors. "Let him. What does that matter to us?" "That is the strange part, Your Majesty. There has been no complaint, no formal protest, no demand sent to the crown. They have simply stopped, as if a switch has been turned off somewhere, and Earth has decided to walk quietly away from every arrangement we shared with them." Euthera's frown deepened, though she still did not grasp the full weight of what her advisor was telling her. She was young, and though clever in the ways of court politics, she had not yet learned how deeply human labor and human patience had woven themselves into the daily machinery of her empire. She would learn soon enough. 3 weeks after the coronation, the shipyard project that Cade Pharaoh oversaw stalled completely. The human engineers who had understood the delicate balance between two very different systems of technology, one built on Dominion crystal engines and the other on human-designed stabilizers, were gone, and the remaining alien engineers struggled to make the two systems work together without them. A test flight scheduled to demonstrate the new cargo vessel to a gathering of noble investors ended in a small, embarrassing engine failure that grounded the ship before it ever left the launch pad. Around the same time, the research station studying long-range communication arrays lost access to a set of data models that only the human scientific team had fully understood how to interpret. Without Celine Vasque's human collaborators, the station's progress slowed to a crawl, and a promised breakthrough that had been announced to the court months earlier quietly vanished from every official update. Small cracks like these began appearing all across the Dominion, in places nobody in the palace had thought to look. A supply route that had once run with perfect efficiency because of a human logistics team suddenly began experiencing delays. A medical program that relied on human-trained specialists to manage rare treatments saw its waiting lists grow longer by the week. None of it was dramatic. None of it looked like an attack. It looked, from the outside, like nothing more than ordinary bad luck, a string of small inconveniences that any large empire might experience from time to time. But those close enough to see the pattern understood exactly what was happening, and it frightened them more than any threat or any weapon could have. General Vash Orith, an old soldier who had fought in 3 border conflicts and had worked alongside human military advisors during a joint defense exercise years earlier, was one of the first to raise the alarm directly to the Queen. "Your Majesty, I must speak plainly," he said during a private council meeting, ignoring the uneasy glances from Doran Kesh beside him. "I have seen this pattern before, though never at this scale. Humans do not typically fight with anger, they fight with absence. When they feel disrespected, they do not shout, they simply decide you are no longer worth their effort, and they remove themselves, quietly, completely, without warning." Euthera sat straighter in her seat, some of her earlier confidence beginning to crack under the weight of the general's words. "You make them sound like children throwing away their toys," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "No, Your Majesty," General Vash said gently. "I make them sound like a species that has learned, faster than any of us expected, exactly how much power there is in choosing not to fight at all." The council fell silent after that. Euthera looked around the table, searching the faces of her advisors for reassurance, and found none. Even Doran Kesh, who had whispered the insult into her ear that first night, now sat quietly, his earlier smile long gone. Back at the human embassy, I received word that a formal request had arrived from the palace, asking for a meeting to discuss the recent changes in cooperation between our two peoples. I read the message twice, noting how carefully it avoided using the word apology, how it dressed the request up in careful diplomatic language, designed to sound like concern rather than desperation. Grace brought the message to me personally, standing in my doorway, with a look I had not seen on her face before, something between surprise and quiet respect. "They want to talk," she said. "They actually want to talk." "Of course they do," I said, setting the message aside without much reaction. Silence has a way of getting attention that words rarely manage. "Are you going to meet with them?" I considered the question for a long moment, thinking not about the Queen, not about her court, but about every human engineer, every scientist, every worker who had spent months or years building something meaningful in a place that ultimately saw them as beneath consideration. I thought about the laughter in that golden hall, how easily it had come, how little thought had gone into the words that caused it. "Not yet," I said finally. "Let them sit with what they have created a little longer first. There is still more they need to understand before any conversation between us would actually mean something." Grace nodded slowly, though I could see the question still forming behind her eyes, the one she did not quite know how to ask yet. What exactly did I want from all of this? Not an apology, not compensation, something else, something harder to name, something that would only become clear as the days ahead continued to unfold, both for the young queen learning the true cost of her own pride, and for me, learning exactly how far quiet consequences could reach when given enough time and enough patience to grow. Outside my window, the twin suns of that world rose again over the golden towers of the palace, and somewhere within those walls, a young queen was beginning, for the first time since her mother's death, to feel the true weight of the crown she wore. Humanity had not always been welcome among the stars, and I had spent enough years studying our own history to understand exactly why silence had become our sharpest tool. When Earth first made contact with the wider galaxy, we arrived with no great fleet, no ancient bloodline, no thousand-year-old empire to our name. What we had instead was a strange, almost stubborn habit of solving problems nobody else wanted to touch. We built bridges between systems that did not trust each other. We repaired engines that other species considered beyond saving. We ran supply lines through dangerous, contested space with a quiet, steady patience that made older civilizations uneasy because they could not decide whether to admire us or fear us. I remembered a story my grandfather used to tell me about how the very first human trade envoys were mocked in almost every court they visited, dismissed as clever animals who had gotten lucky with technology. And in every one of those courts, humans had done exactly what I had done in that golden hall. They said nothing. They simply left, quietly, and let the consequences speak instead. It became something of a saying among older diplomats from other species, half joke and half warning, passed down through generations of galactic politics. Humans do not shout when they are insulted. They simply stop showing up. And when humans stop showing up, entire systems begin to fall apart in ways nobody expected, because nobody had bothered to notice how much weight we had quietly been carrying all along. I thought about all of this while sitting in my office late one evening, reviewing reports that continued to arrive from across the Dominion, each one describing some new inconvenience, some small failure that traced back, eventually, to an empty seat where a human engineer or scientist used to sit. Grace entered without knocking, which had become something of a habit between us over the past few weeks, holding a data tablet with an expression I had not seen on her before, somewhere between excitement and disbelief. "Elias, you need to see this," she said, setting the tablet down in front of me. I glanced at the screen. It was a formal message from an entirely different power, the Tesseran Concord, a rival civilization that had spent decades competing with the Veiled Dominion for influence across this section of the galaxy. The message was an invitation, polite and carefully worded, requesting a private meeting between Earth's diplomatic corps and Concord leadership to discuss what they called new opportunities for partnership. "They heard," Grace said, watching my face for a reaction. "Everyone has heard by now. The Concord wants to know if Earth would be interested in relocating some of our shared projects to their territory instead." I read the message twice, considering its careful language, the way it avoided mentioning the Dominion directly, while clearly implying exactly what it meant. "They smell an opportunity," I said finally. "Should we take the meeting?" I thought about this for a long moment. Taking the meeting would send an unmistakable message to the Veiled Dominion, a message far louder than any words I could have spoken in that throne room. It would tell them, in the clearest terms possible, that humanity had other options, other partners eager to receive what the Dominion had so carelessly dismissed. "Set up the meeting," I said, "but do not confirm anything. I want them to know we are listening. I do not yet want them to know what we intend to do with what we hear." Grace nodded and left to arrange things, and I returned to the reports piling up on my desk, each one a small piece of evidence in a pattern that was growing clearer by the day. The Concord's representative, a calm, thoughtful diplomat named Oren Vache, met with me 3 days later in a quiet meeting room within our embassy, chosen specifically because it had no view of the Golden Palace towers that dominated so much of the capital's skyline. "I will be direct, Ambassador Marsh," Oren said, settling into his seat across from me. "We have watched the situation between your people and the Dominion with great interest. Queen Euthera's court has made a costly mistake, and mistakes of that size rarely go unnoticed among those of us who compete with the Dominion for standing in this region. You want our engineers," I said simply, cutting through whatever careful diplomatic language he might have prepared. Oren smiled slightly, seeming almost relieved that I had chosen directness over the usual dance of formal negotiation. "We want your partnership, Ambassador. Your people have proven themselves remarkably capable in fields our own scientists have struggled with for generations. The Dominion took that value for granted. We would not make the same error." I studied him carefully, searching for any sign of the same dismissiveness I had encountered in that golden throne room, any hint that he saw humanity as simply a useful tool rather than a genuine partner. I found none, though I remained cautious. Trust, I had learned recently in the most painful way possible, was something that had to be earned slowly, not assumed simply because someone offered kind words when it was convenient for them to do so. "We will consider your proposal," I told him, "but understand this clearly. Earth does not seek revenge against the Dominion by working with you. If we choose to expand cooperation with the Concord, it will be because your people have earned that cooperation honestly, not because we wish to punish anyone else." Oren nodded, seeming to understand and even respect this distinction. "That is a fair position, Ambassador. I only hope Queen Euthera's court comes to understand it as clearly as you have explained it to me." Word of the meeting reached the Dominion Palace within a day, exactly as I expected it would. Nothing in politics stays quiet for long, especially not in a capital where gossip moved faster than official messages ever could. Inside the palace, panic began to spread through the council chambers in a way that even General Vache's earlier warnings had not managed to create. The idea of losing human cooperation entirely was troubling enough. The idea of that cooperation shifting toward their oldest rival was something else entirely, a nightmare scenario that threatened not just inconvenience, but the Dominion's entire standing among the galaxy's major powers. Euthera called an emergency council meeting the following morning, her voice carrying none of the confident sharpness it had held during her coronation just weeks earlier. "How bad is this?" she asked, looking around the table at her advisors, each of whom seemed reluctant to be the one who answered first. Doran Kesh finally spoke, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to genuine worry. "Your Majesty, if the Concord secures a formal partnership with Earth, we stand to lose far more than a few engineering projects. Every trade route we currently dominate along the northern systems could shift toward Concord-controlled space within a matter of years. Our standing among the smaller allied worlds would weaken considerably. Some might even begin questioning whether the Dominion remains the region's leading power at all." Euthera closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of what her advisor had just described, a consequence so much larger than she had imagined possible when she had spoken those careless words in her throne room. "This began because I made a joke," she said quietly, almost to herself. "A single joke, and now it threatens to unravel everything my mother spent her life building." Nobody at the table offered comfort, because nobody could honestly provide any. The truth of the situation sat heavily over the room, undeniable and unavoidable. General Vash finally spoke again, his tone gentler than before, though no less serious. "Your Majesty, if I may offer a suggestion, this situation did not develop because of raw power or military threat. It developed because of a choice, one single insult, delivered in a moment of youthful pride. If a choice created this problem, perhaps only a choice, a different one, can begin to resolve it." "You are suggesting I apologize," Yathera said, something in her voice caught between resistance and exhaustion. "I am suggesting, Your Majesty, that you consider what an apology given honestly, rather than one given out of desperation, might actually accomplish. There is a difference between the two, and I suspect the human ambassador is sharp enough to know exactly which one he is receiving, should you choose to offer it." Yathera said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the polished table in front of her, seeing perhaps for the first time the true reflection of her own actions staring back at her. Meanwhile, back at the human embassy, I received an unexpected report from one of our monitoring stations near the shipyard, where Cade Pharaoh's project had stalled. The station's automated systems had detected unusual activity, a private shuttle departing the palace grounds late at night, heading not toward any official destination, but toward the outer district where our embassy stood. Grace brought me the alert immediately, her expression tense. "Someone from the palace is coming here," she said, "unannounced, no formal request, no advance notice. That is completely against protocol." I set down the report I had been reviewing and looked toward the window, watching the distant lights of a small shuttle descending through the evening sky toward our landing platform. "Let them come," I said calmly. "Protocol has already been broken once in this story, Grace. It seems only fitting that it might be broken again, this time from the other direction." Grace left to alert our security team, though I instructed her to keep things quiet. No dramatic show of force, no unnecessary tension. Whatever was arriving tonight, I suspected it was not a threat. I stood at the window and watched the shuttle land, its doors opening slowly, revealing a single figure stepping out into the cool evening air, wrapped in a plain traveling cloak that did nothing to hide the unmistakable posture of someone raised since childhood to carry themselves like royalty, even when trying desperately not to look like one. It was Yathera. She had come alone, without guards, without advisors, without any of the ceremony that had surrounded her every movement since the day she claimed her crown. She stood there in the fading light, looking suddenly much younger than the confident queen who had mocked me in front of her entire court, looking instead like exactly what she was underneath all that gold and ceremony. A young woman, barely more than a girl, carrying a weight far heavier than she had ever expected to bear this soon in her life. I met her at the embassy entrance myself, waving off the security officers who moved to intercept her. "Your Majesty," I said, offering the same correct, careful bow I had given her in that golden hall weeks earlier. "This is unexpected." She looked at me for a long moment before speaking, and I could see something in her expression that had not been there during our first meeting. Something closer to honesty than pride. "I know," she said quietly. "I know it is unexpected. I also know that I owe you a conversation, Ambassador Marsh, one I should have had weeks ago, before things reached the point they have now reached." I studied her carefully, searching for any hint of performance, any trace of the calculated cleverness that had colored our first encounter. I found instead something rawer, something that looked almost like fear, though not the same fear that had driven her cruel words in that throne room. This was a different kind of fear entirely, the fear of someone beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, the true size of the mistake she had made. "Then I suppose," I said, stepping aside to let her enter, "we should finally have that conversation." I led her to a small private room away from the main embassy offices, a simple space with plain chairs and a single window overlooking the quiet garden Grace had planted months earlier, filled with flowers brought carefully from Earth, small blooms that had somehow managed to survive in foreign soil. Ethera sat across from me, her cloak still wrapped tightly around her shoulders as though it offered some kind of protection from the conversation ahead. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I did not feel the need to fill the silence, and I suspected she was still gathering the courage to begin. "I did not come here because my council forced me to," she said finally, her voice quieter than I remembered from that golden hall. "I came because I needed to understand something, and I could not understand it by reading reports or listening to my advisors argue among themselves." "What is it you wanted to understand, Your Majesty?" She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something genuine in her expression, not the practiced confidence of a queen performing for her court, but the honest confusion of someone still learning who she truly was underneath the crown. "Why?" she said simply. "Why did you say nothing that night? I insulted you in front of my entire court. I called your people barely evolved. I mocked everything your species has built. Any other envoy I have read about in our histories would have argued, would have defended their people, would have demanded some kind of respect in that moment. You simply bowed and walked away. I have spent weeks trying to understand what that silence meant, and I still do not fully know." I considered her question carefully before answering, wanting to give her something honest rather than something simply comforting. "Your Majesty, when I was young, my grandfather told me something I have carried with me ever since. He said that the people who shout the loudest for respect are often the ones who never truly believe they deserve it in the first place. Real respect is not something you can demand from a room that has already decided not to give it. Arguing with you that night would have meant staying in a place where I was not wanted, spending my breath trying to convince people who had already made up their minds to laugh at me. I chose not to spend myself that way." Ethera absorbed this for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her cloak. "So you left instead," she said. "I left instead," I confirmed. Not out of anger, not even out of hurt, though I will admit there was some of that too, buried underneath everything else. I left because staying would have meant accepting the idea that my presence in that room needed your permission to matter. It does not. My people's worth was never something your court had the power to grant or take away, no matter how loudly they laughed that night. Something shifted in Ethera's expression, a kind of quiet recognition settling over her features. "And the withdrawal," she said, "the engineers, the scientists, the projects you pulled away one by one, was that meant as punishment?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Your Majesty. It was never punishment, it was simply a choice, the same kind of choice I made when I walked out of your throne room. My people worked hard for the Dominion, offering skill and patience your own systems desperately needed, and in return, we received laughter and mockery from the very throne meant to represent the values of your entire civilization. I did not remove our people to hurt you. I removed them because I no longer believed they were valued where they stood, and I refused to let Earth's people spend themselves where they are not wanted." Ethera was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands folded in her lap. "My mother used to tell me something similar," she said eventually, her voice softer than before. "She said that a true ruler never has to remind anyone of their power, because real power is felt, not announced." I did not understand what she meant until she was gone, and I was left alone on a throne everyone expected me to fail at. "Is that why you said what you said that night?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. She nodded slowly, her composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "My council whispered constantly in the weeks after my mother's passing, wondering aloud whether I was strong enough to hold the throne, whether I would need guidance every step of the way, whether the Dominion had made a mistake, crowning someone so young. Doran Kesh suggested that putting a lesser species in their place during my coronation would prove my strength to the older houses watching closely. I wanted so desperately to be seen as capable that I let his suggestion guide my words that night, without truly thinking about what those words would cost, or who they would hurt. I studied her carefully, recognizing something painfully familiar in what she described: a young leader, desperate to prove herself, surrounded by voices eager to use that desperation for their own purposes. "Your Majesty, may I be honest with you about something?" She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "Please." "I do not believe you are cruel," I said. "I believe you were frightened, and frightened people often reach for the easiest target in the room, rather than confronting the much harder truth staring back at them. That night, the easiest target happened to be me, and my species happened to be new enough, different enough, that mocking us seemed harmless in the moment. But there is nothing harmless about deciding another people's worth is something you can measure or dismiss based on how young their history happens to be. Euthera flinched slightly at this, though she did not look away. "You are right," she said quietly. "I judged your people by the length of your history, as though the number of years a civilization has existed determines the value of what they can offer. My own family has ruled for 10,000 years, and yet in 3 days as queen, I nearly destroyed relationships that took decades to build, all because I feared looking weak in front of people who had already decided to judge me regardless of what I did." "What do you want from this conversation, Your Majesty?" I asked gently. "You did not travel here unannounced, breaking every protocol your court holds sacred, simply to explain your reasoning to me. There is something else you came here seeking." Euthera took a slow breath before answering, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different kind of steadiness, one that felt less like performance and more like genuine resolve. "I came to ask what it would take to earn back what I threw away so carelessly. Not because my council is panicking over trade routes and shipyards, though they are. Not because the Tesseran Concord smells opportunity in my mistake, though I know they do. I came because I have spent weeks thinking about that empty seat where you once stood in my court, and I have realized that losing your people's trust cost my empire something far more valuable than efficient engineers or clever scientists. It cost us the chance to be seen as a civilization worth trusting at all." I sat with her words for a long moment, considering everything that had led to this quiet room, this late evening conversation between a young queen and a human envoy who had never intended to become part of any larger story. "Respect is not something I can hand you simply because you have asked for it honestly tonight," I said finally. "It is not something my people can restore with a single conversation, no matter how sincere. What I can tell you is this: Earth does not hold grudges the way some of your histories might suggest we would. We do not seek revenge, and we do not wish to see the Dominion weakened simply to satisfy some sense of injured pride. But we also will not return to a partnership built on the same foundation as before, one where our worth could be dismissed the moment it became convenient for someone in power to do so." "Then, what foundation would you accept instead?" Euthera asked, leaning forward slightly, genuine curiosity replacing some of the earlier tension in her posture. "One built on equal standing," I said simply. "Not because your court has decided to grant us equality as some kind of gift, but because you have genuinely come to understand that equality was never yours to grant in the first place. It already existed. Your court simply chose not to see it that night." Euthera nodded slowly, absorbing this, and for the first time since she had arrived, I saw something resembling true understanding settle over her features, rather than simple political calculation. "I cannot undo what I said in that hall," she said. "I cannot erase the laughter, or the humiliation you must have felt standing there while my court mocked your people. But I can promise you this, Ambassador Marsh. I will not lead a court that measures the worth of any species by the length of their history, or the size of their fleet, or how loudly they demand to be respected. If I am to rule for even a fraction of the years my mother did, I would rather rule a dominion that has learned this lesson early than one that continues repeating the same mistake until it eventually costs us everything." I studied her for a long moment, weighing her words carefully, searching for any hint of the same calculated performance I had witnessed in her throne room weeks earlier. I found none. What sat across from me now was not a queen performing strength for an audience, but a young woman genuinely grappling with the consequences of her own actions, perhaps for the first time in her short reign. "That is a good beginning, Your Majesty," I said finally. "Though I suspect the harder part still lies ahead of you. Words spoken quietly in a private room are easy enough to offer. Living by them in front of a court that expects you to behave exactly as you did before will require far more courage than the performance you gave at your coronation." Ithera almost smiled at this, a small, tired expression that carried more honesty than anything she had said in that golden hall. "You are not wrong, Ambassador, but I did not travel here unannounced. Breaking protocol my entire life has trained me to follow without question, because the easy path suddenly seemed appealing. I came because I finally understood that the harder path was the only one worth taking." We sat together in that quiet room for a while longer, the conversation shifting from formal diplomacy into something closer to two people simply trying to understand each other honestly, perhaps for the first time since we had met. Outside the window, Grace's small garden swayed gently in the evening breeze, flowers from a distant world somehow thriving in soil that had never expected to hold them. I did not know yet whether Ithera's words that night would translate into lasting change, or whether the pressures of her court would eventually pull her back toward the same fears that had driven her cruel performance weeks earlier. But I recognized, sitting there across from her, that something important had shifted between us, something that could not have happened through anger, through argument, or through demands. It had happened because I said nothing at all that night in her throne room, and let the silence teach a lesson that words never could have delivered nearly as clearly. Ithera returned to the palace before dawn, slipping back into her private quarters before her council woke to discover she had ever left. I did not know, in the days that followed, whether our conversation would remain simply a private moment between two people, or whether it would grow into something the entire Dominion would eventually witness. I did not have to wait long for my answer. 10 days after her late-night visit to our embassy, an official announcement arrived, formally requesting my presence at a special session of the Dominion Court, one described only as addressing matters of galactic cooperation. Grace brought me the invitation with a raised eyebrow, clearly suspicious of what it might actually involve. "Do you trust her?" she asked, watching my face as I read through the formal language. "I trust that she came to us honestly that night," I said. "Whether her court will allow her to act on that honesty is a different question entirely." We arrived at the palace on the appointed day, and I noticed immediately how different the atmosphere felt compared to the coronation weeks earlier. The same golden hall stood before us. The same rows of nobles filled the seats along either side, but something in the air had shifted. Where laughter and easy mockery had filled the room during my last visit, now there was only quiet, uncertain tension, as though everyone present understood that whatever happened today would matter far beyond the walls of this single chamber. Ithera sat upon her throne, her crown resting more comfortably now than it had during the coronation, as though she had grown somewhat into its weight over these past weeks. When she saw me enter, she rose from her seat, a gesture that caused a ripple of surprised murmurs to spread through the assembled nobles. Queens did not rise for envoys of any species, and certainly not for one from a civilization her court had so recently mocked. "Ambassador Marsh," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Thank you for accepting this invitation." I offered the same correct bow I had given her twice before, waiting to see what she intended to do with the attention of her entire court, now focused so completely upon her. "Weeks ago," Ithera began, turning to address her assembled nobles rather than speaking only to me, "I stood in this very hall and spoke words I believed, at the time, demonstrated my strength as your new queen. I mocked a species barely known to our galaxy, dismissing their worth because their history was shorter than our own, because I believed proving my power meant proving I could belittle someone smaller than myself." The hall remained utterly silent, every noble present hanging on her words, uncertain where this was leading. "I was wrong," she continued, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was admitting in front of the entire court. "Not simply wrong in the political sense. though the consequences of my words nearly cost this Dominion partnerships and standing that took generations to build, I was wrong in a much deeper sense. I judged an entire people by the length of their history rather than the depth of their character, and in doing so, I revealed far more about my own insecurity than anything true about the species I mocked. Doran Kesh, seated near the throne, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unprepared for this direction. I noticed several older nobles exchanging glances, some skeptical, others cautiously intrigued. Ambassador Marsh did not argue with me that night, Yathera said, turning back to face me directly. He did not shout, or demand respect, or lower himself to match the cruelty I offered him. He simply bowed and walked away, and in doing so, taught this entire court something none of us expected to learn. He taught us that respect cannot be commanded through mockery, and that true strength does not need an audience of laughter to prove itself real. She stepped down from her throne then, an action that caused an audible gasp to ripple through the hall, since Dominion queens rarely left the elevated platform during formal court sessions, especially not to approach a foreign envoy directly. "Ambassador Marsh," she said, standing before me now at equal height. No throne separating us, no elevated platform placing her above my position. I cannot undo the words I spoke in this hall weeks ago, but I can promise you, in front of every noble house gathered here today, that the Veiled Dominion will not measure the worth of any species by how young their history happens to be. Your people prove this to us, not through argument, but through the simple, undeniable weight of your absence. I am asking, in front of my entire court, for the opportunity to rebuild what my carelessness nearly destroyed, not as a favor granted to a lesser species, but as a partnership between equals who have earned that standing honestly. I stood there for a long moment, aware of every eye in that golden hall watching to see how I would respond, remembering the laughter that had once filled this same space, the mockery that had sent me walking out in silence weeks earlier. This moment felt different, and I allowed myself to believe, at least for now, that it truly was. "Your Majesty," I said finally, my voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Words spoken honestly, in front of an entire court, carry weight that private apologies never could. I accept that you have spoken honestly today, but I would be doing my own people a disservice if I pretended that words alone could restore what was lost. Trust, once withdrawn, does not return simply because it has been asked for sincerely. It returns slowly, through actions proven over time, through partnerships built carefully, rather than assumed easily. InHFY. Yathera nodded, seeming to have expected exactly this answer. "Then let us begin building that trust today, Ambassador, not by restoring every project exactly as it stood before, but by creating something new between us, something built from the beginning on the foundation you have described. Equal standing, earned honestly, rather than granted carelessly." I considered her proposal, weighing it against everything that had happened since that first cruel night, against the weeks of quiet withdrawal, the careful messages sent to shipyards and research stations, the meeting with the Tesseran Concord that had shown Earth other paths available to us. None of that history could simply be erased by a single speech, however sincere it seemed. "Earth will consider a new framework of cooperation," I said finally, "one negotiated openly, with clear terms that reflect the value both our peoples bring to any partnership between us. I will bring your proposal back to my superiors, and we will begin discussions properly, as equals, rather than assuming anything has already been decided here today." A murmur passed through the court, some nobles clearly disappointed that I had not simply accepted her apology outright and restored everything to how it stood before, others nodding with quiet respect at the careful, measured nature of my response. Yathera, however, seemed satisfied rather than frustrated by my answer. "That is fair, Ambassador. More than fair, given everything my carelessness cost your people. I would expect nothing less from a species that has taught this court such an important lesson through silence alone." In the weeks that followed, formal negotiations began between Earth's diplomatic corps and the Dominion Council, this time conducted with a very different tone than any cooperation before it. InHFY personally attended several sessions, something previous rulers had rarely bothered to do, insisting on understanding directly what her people could offer and what they genuinely needed from any partnership, rather than simply assuming human labor would always be available regardless of how it was treated. Cade Farrow's shipyard project resumed, though under new terms that recognized human engineers as equal partners in design decisions rather than simply skilled labor brought in to solve problems others could not. Celine Vasque's research station welcomed back its human scientific team, though this time with formal recognition given publicly for the specific contributions they had made, something that had never happened under the previous arrangement. The Tesseran Concord's Oren Vache, upon learning that Earth had chosen to rebuild its partnership with the Dominion, rather than shift entirely toward Concord territory, sent a message that surprised me with its lack of resentment. "You have made the right choice, Ambassador Marsh," he wrote, "though I will admit some disappointment on behalf of my own people. Perhaps someday, when the galaxy has learned this lesson more broadly, our own civilizations can build something meaningful together as well, on the same equal footing you have insisted upon with the Dominion." I did not close the door on that possibility, understanding that the galaxy remained large, and humanity's reputation, once built on quiet reliability and careful self-respect, would likely open many more doors in the years ahead, doors that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with simply being valued correctly from the very beginning. Grace, watching all of this unfold from her position within the embassy, once asked me a question late one evening as we reviewed the final terms of the new agreement with the Dominion. "Do you think she truly changed, Elias, or did she simply learn how expensive her pride turned out to be?" I considered the question carefully before answering, thinking about that late-night visit to our embassy, the honesty in Euthera's voice as she sat across from me in that quiet room, the courage it had taken for a young queen to step down from her throne in front of her entire court and admit fault so publicly. "I think both things can be true at once," I said finally. "She learned an expensive lesson, yes, but I also believe, watching her these past weeks, that something in her genuinely shifted, beyond simple political calculation. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps growth rarely arrives cleanly, without some mixture of genuine understanding and hard consequence forcing the lesson home." Months later, I stood once more in that golden hall, though this time for a very different occasion, a formal signing ceremony marking the new partnership between Earth and the Veil Dominion, built this time on terms that recognized both our peoples as equals, regardless of how long or short our respective histories happened to be. Euthera approached me after the ceremony concluded, the crown resting easily upon her head now, none of the uncertain weight I had noticed during her coronation still visible in her bearing. "I owe you something I never properly said, Ambassador Marsh," she told me quietly, away from the attention of the gathered nobles and diplomats celebrating the new agreement. "Thank you, not simply for the partnership we have rebuilt, but for the lesson your silence taught me that first night. I have thought about it often since then. You could have argued with me, you could have demanded an apology immediately, could have threatened consequences directly to my face in front of my entire court. Instead, you simply walked away and let me discover on my own exactly what that silence meant." "Your Majesty," I said, "I did not walk away that night hoping to teach you anything. I walked away because staying in that room, arguing for respect that should have been given freely, would have meant accepting an idea I refuse to believe. That my people's worth depends on convincing others of it through argument or performance. We are worth exactly what we are, regardless of whether a room full of nobles chooses to recognize that in the moment. If you learned something valuable from watching me leave, I am glad, but the lesson was never mine to teach. It was simply the truth, waiting quietly for someone to notice it." Euthera nodded slowly, something like genuine respect settling into her expression, the same expression I remembered from that quiet private room weeks earlier, honest and unguarded in a way her public performances rarely allowed. "Then I hope, Ambassador, that this Dominion continues learning that same truth, long after both of us have left our current positions to whoever comes after us. I hope so too, Your Majesty, I said, and I meant it honestly. Later that evening, back at the embassy, I stood alone at my office window, watching the twin suns set once more over the golden towers of the palace, painting the sky in the same orange and violet colors I remembered from that very first night, when I had walked out of a throne room in complete silence, uncertain myself of exactly what consequences my quiet exit might eventually create. I thought about everything that had happened since, the careful withdrawal of human cooperation, the quiet ripples that had spread across an entire civilization, the late-night visit from a frightened young queen, finally beginning to understand the true weight of her crown, and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust that followed, built this time on a foundation neither of us would allow to crumble so easily again. Humanity had arrived among the stars only recently, young by nearly every measure the older civilizations used to judge worth and standing. But I had learned something valuable in these past months, something I suspected would follow our species through every encounter yet to come across this vast and complicated galaxy. Sometimes the loudest statement a person can make is no statement at all. Sometimes walking away, quietly, without anger, without argument, without a single word spoken in your own defense, says more about your worth than any speech ever could, and forces those who dismissed you to discover, in their own time and through their own consequences, exactly what they lost the moment they decided you were not worth their respect. I had said nothing that night in Queen Yathera's golden hall, and in the end, that silence had said everything that needed to be said.